Very excited. Ooh. Very excited to talk with all of you about creating accessible communication. Today will be a basic building block, going through what are the simple steps to get started on creating accessible communications for students with disabilities. So a little bit about me. My pronouns are she, her. I am currently a marketing coordinator at Illinois State University. I recently transitioned out of the Office of Admissions at ISU and now work in event management, dining, and hospitality. Why I think this topic is so important. Well, 65% of the global population has either a permanent, temporary, or situational disability that requires them to use inclusive technology, and whether that's a screen reader, text to speech, or captioning, it's important that we make sure that the communication we're putting out there to students and individuals is accessible to everyone, and that we're meeting students where they are. So the way I've set this up is that I'm just going to go through a handful of first steps towards creating accessible communication. And I'll go through and explain each situation. And at the end, if you have any questions, we can definitely go through those. So let's jump right in. Camel casing. So this is important because if you don't capitalize the first letter of each word, whether that's in a hashtag, a link, an email address, sometimes screen readers or voice to text can misread things. A commonly used example for this is the hashtag Black Lives Matter. If you capitalize it, it reads it as it should, but if you keep it all lowercase, it reads it as Black Lives Matter, which obviously is not what the hashtag is meant to say. Also, just for skimmability for students without visual impairments, creating hashtags, links, emails with the camel case, first capitalizing the first letter of each word, just increases skimmability and overall comprehension for people. So I've included a bunch of examples of each below. It's helpful to so one of the examples is hashtag your Redbird life. So the Y, the R, and the L are all capitalized. Same goes for links to the emails. And let's go to the next. If you see me looking off to this way, I'm looking at my other screen with notes. Emoji usage. So this one is for email, social media, text messages, various kinds of content. When I worked in admissions, I was in charge of creating emails and texts for various student and parent populations, and it was fun to include emojis to just liven up the communication, grab attention, because they can be fun and they can visually elevate your content, but it's important to be specific and use them in very, very sparingly ways, very smart ways. So I'll go through a few of those. Don't put an emoji in the middle of a sentence. I'll talk about this a bit more on the next slide, unless it makes sense to be in the middle of a sentence. Use emojis sparingly and don't use the same emoji more than once. So if you're announcing an update recently, I had to post about our hours changing for our student center because ISU was closed yesterday due to a winter storm. So I only used one exclamation point. I didn't use a bunch because obviously one exclamation point is still going to get people's attention in feed. So you don't need multiple. Always look up what an emoji means. I use Emojipedia. This is the similar, just a good rule of thumb across the board. I know I use that a lot for GIFs. I always look up what the origin of a GIF is before I use it. So same thing goes with emojis. And don't use emojis as bullet points. I will discuss this a bit more in depth later on. But even though it may look visually appealing, it is not inclusive, and it's slightly tedious and annoying for a screen reader or a student using inclusive technology to use that. So here's a bit more of what I was explaining in that first sentence about putting emojis in the middle. So obviously, what I want to say is, did you know that Illinois State has a Tree Campus USA designation? And a fun way to spice it up is to put an emoji in the middle of it. So a bad way to say it is, did you know Illinois State University has a deciduous tree campus designation? Because the definition of that emoji is deciduous tree. So that's how a screen reader or voice to text program would read that sentence if you had the emoji in the middle. I included a few examples of some of the other definitions of emojis just as a reference point. But that's what I mean when I say it's not accessible. Is a screen reader is going to read that and it's not going to make sense, and they're not going to get what you're trying to, they're not going to pick up what you're trying to put down. So it's best just to include the emoji at the end of a sentence or at the end of the content altogether. All right, descriptive blinking. So this is for all types of communication, but specifically in general, you can avoid click here and read more language. On social media, you're not able to hyperlink, unfortunately. Hopefully they do that at some point. But a way around this is if you have a short link or perhaps like a vanity link that your web department has created to take, like if you have a very, very long link, you can create a vanity link to take you to a certain website. So I included a couple examples of short links that we've put on social media. So sign up today at illinoisstate.edu/visit or discover more illinoisstate.edu/academics. The difference between that and the click here and read more is that it explains to the screen reader or the person using a screen reader or other kinds of inclusive technology, it gives them context of like what that link is going to do for them or what they'll be using that link for. If you just say click here, or below you'll see how to not link in text properly. To select your residence hall, click here. It doesn't really tell the person reading that sentence what exactly they're going to get from that link. But if you do use this form to select your residence hall, it explains exactly what that link is going to give them, gives them context, and provides a better user experience for them. So I kind of jumped ahead. So that first bullet point, the sign up today and the discover more, those are great for social media or text messages. And oh yes, live transcription should have been enabled on this. Thank you for whoever did that. How to link properly in an email, PDF, or website. It's important to look at the examples below and like the bad example number 2 of the HTTPS : // those are just not necessary, and a screen reader or voice to text would read that out letter by letter for the person, and it's not needed, so you can just remove that and it can still be hyperlinked. So you'll see a better example below. You can find more information about our majors at illinoisstate.edu/academics. Another fun fact is that most often you don't need the back. So you'll see in the first one that the bad example number 2, oh, skipped ahead. You'll see in the bad example number 2 that there's a backslash at the end. And most often for links, you don't need it, so you can remove it. And it just makes things a little bit more concise. Okay, moving on, flyers and PDFs. So something my current department does on all of our publications and flyers is we include an accessibility statement at the bottom. And I've included an example on this page. Basically, it just says this document is available in alternative formats by contacting, put either the name of a person or a department name at phone number and email. That way you give people two different options of how they can contact you. This is good to include on all print statements and digital, like if you have digital signage around, it's good to include on that as well. Avoid using flyers and PDFs on social media or embedded in emails at all costs. Especially images of flyers on social media are not accessible in any way. And PDFs are really hard to make accessible. I don't know if anyone's tried, but it's really hard to make sure that all of the text is selectable so that a screen reader could see that there's even text on that page. So if you have no other option but to include an image of a flyer on social media, I would recommend that you put all of the information that's on the flyer in the caption so that a screen reader would be able to get the same information in the caption that they would in the flyer. Similarly, if you have someone who's hardcore advocating to upload a PDF to like embed a PDF in an email or on a website, if you have the resources and capability, suggest that you just make it a website, find a place to host it for your institution or your organization on your website, and just take all that information and put it directly onto the website, because that way anyone using inclusive technology would be able to access it. All right. Alt text. So the good thing is that most programs, social media platforms, if you use a CRM or a customer relation management tool, most programs offer alt text for photos. And if you're like embedding a video, they offer it for videos. I know in admissions we used Slate and it offered both of those options. So alt text is really great because it provides the person using inclusive technology the ability to understand what the photo is showing. So if someone has a visual impairment and they're not able to see the photo, the alt text would be read aloud by the inclusive technology explaining what the photo is. So whether it's a photo of students on a quad and it looks like they're playing games, you can say students on quad playing games or students on quad studying. So no more than 6 words is a good rule of thumb, because you want to concisely explain what's in the photo. But that way that communication is also accessible, or that visual aspect of your communication is accessible to those students. And you should use this wherever possible. It's definitely a capability on most, if not all, web platforms. And often I think you can inspect the image and see the alt text of what's already there, but use it on web, email, PDF, social media. If you can't find an alt text version, you can always put a description underneath the photo. You just got to do the legwork to see what's available to you that you can use. Alternatively, or additionally, not alternatively, video captioning. If you don't have the capability or resource to caption your videos yourself, you can always use the auto-generated versions. Luckily on social media, most social media platforms offer some type of auto-generated caption tool. So YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter all offer them. And so most often if you're linking a YouTube video in an email or in a text message, if you have auto-generated captions uploaded when you publish the video, then that takes care of that, especially if you're sharing that YouTube video through other media channels or just communication channels. I believe the only one that you can't edit the auto captions on is Twitter. But this is great because sometimes if a person talks too quickly or it spells a person's name. Like often my name is spelled with the A, like ALANA, by auto-generated captions. So most offer the ability to go in and edit the auto-generated captions. But if you don't have the resources to devote to captioning videos yourself through Adobe or whatever video platforms, programs you use, this is always the bare minimum that you can do to make sure that your video content is accessible to students with disabilities, I think. And usually accuracy is pretty good. I think sometimes it just messes up on names and stuff like that. All right. Bullet points. Fun. So I mentioned this, I think, in my first slide or second slide when I talked about emojis. But don't use emojis as bullet points. It does look cool. You think it elevates your content, but in reality, it's pretty tedious for a screen reader or a voice-to-text program, because it reads that emoji out before the text. And can you imagine how confusing that would be if you're reading and it says bento box and then it says Watterson Dining Commons will be open from this date to this date. It's just one of our dining halls on campus. That would be so confusing. The two don't really mesh, and it leaves it to the person listening to that text to then figure out what the important information is and what the context of that is. So best to just use regular bullet points. And then it's important to use the bullet point tool that's in your taskbar for whatever program you're using. Don't just use a hyphen. It's really important for inclusive technology to be able to recognize hierarchy within text. So whether that's like a heading 1, where that's obviously the title of whatever you're about to say, paragraph heading 2, paragraph heading 3, and so on. And then if you have bullet points, it just helps the screen reader to recognize where the hierarchy in the text is and how it should read it. And that also helps for skimmability. So even for people who don't use inclusive technology, it's helpful to consume what you're giving to them quicker, and more often than not, they're going to get the most important information out of that communication if you use this use hierarchy within your communication. Okay, so I have some resources for you. I will submit this to April and have her upload it to the website after. I'm going to switch back so that no one's annoyed by that GIF just continuing to run. But actually, we'll move forward to this. I will upload this so that you have access to this as the conference wraps up and you want to reference this back, and then you can have access to those resources as well. I think it's important to note that a lot of this information that I've just presented to you was self-taught or taught to me because of mistakes I've made in the past. And so I want you all to know that as you move forward through this progress or through this process, that it is okay to make mistakes as long as you are putting in the effort to make sure your communication is accessible to students. So, obviously I've stated this one before, but the emojis as bullet points, realized how inaccessible that was to students and how annoying that must be for a screen reader. And so adjusted that moving forward, or wasn't as on top of video captioning as I should have been, because it was an added task that I would have to go through and do. And then realized from a DM of, hey, can you add auto captions to that? So it's all about putting the effort in and looking into what resources you have available to you through the tools that you use, whether that is a CRM, looking at your profiles on social media to see what auto-generated captions or alt text options you have available to you. It's important to meet your students where they are and ensure that your communication is accessible to them. And these are just a few of the steps that you can take to reach that point. So let's see. Time-wise, I went through that rather quickly. Might have been a bit of nerves, but I would love to open it up to questions if anyone has anything to talk about.
Yeah, it looks like there are a couple of questions in the chat. I know one of them was asking in the don't use more than once rule of thumb, which was pretty early in your presentation, I think the first or second slide. Does it mean in sequence or in a whole work?
So that's a good question. I think you can have multiple emojis in a caption or in content, but I wouldn't put them multiple in a row. So sometimes I've seen in the past that, like I mentioned, updating hours or giving an hours update for one of our dining centers or a student center. And I've seen some people be like red exclamation points across the board, and then on the next line they go into what they wanted to talk about. So that is excessive because a screen reader would read all of those. So that's why I suggest using them sparingly. So like only one exclamation point, or if at the end of your sentence you want to put the emoji of the yum face, of like the smiley face with like the tongue sticking out, that means yum, or and like a plate of food if you're talking about food. I work in EMDH now, so it's all of my mind is dining and food related. But if you wanted to put two emojis at the end, I think that's fine. Or emoji after one sentence, and then you have another sentence and another emoji if you think they relate to each separate sentence. It's just a matter of looking at your captions and thinking, how would a screen reader read this? And there are even some programs you can use. I believe your iPhone, if you have iPhone, they have the ability, you have the ability to toggle that on and off in your settings. So you can always check that way. But there are definitely other platforms you can use to check to see how a screen reader or a voice to text would read that. But I would just say, keep that in mind and maybe don't use more than 3. I hate to put a number on it, but just don't be excessive in putting like a dozen in there, because it's just not accessible to people. I hope that answers that question. Jump in if it didn't. I think Abby.
Yeah, Abby had that question. Another question was, Ellen was wanting to know about Canva, and is Canva accessible? And if you want to speak to
that is a good question. I don't use Canva as much for, most often I use Canva to edit, like adding like small graphics to social media. I don't really use it for PDFs, so I could not speak to if it was accessible. A majority of my knowledge is using Adobe products and making PDFs accessible through that. So Ellen, I would suggest, I can definitely look into that and email out an answer, Ellen, if you want to connect with me. I have to say though, I am not sure because I don't use Canva as much. But if anyone else knows, feel free to jump in.
I think it was mentioned in the chat for those of you that may not, maybe joining from your phone, or sometimes it's a little bit harder on Zoom to read all the chats, that it was mentioned in the chat that Rebecca wanted to add in terms of social media accessibility, posting pictures, as well as other marketing materials, that color visibility and contrast is also important for visual impairments. For example, using white text over a red background rather than black text. So I don't know, Elena, if there's anything you wanted to add to kind of that comment.
No, that perfectly explains it. And I'm glad that you brought that up, Rebecca. Color visibility and contrast is very important to keep in mind. With, if you're doing marketing materials, it may seem cool to do all these fun, vibrant colors, but sometimes even people without visual impairments have issues reading those. So it's best to look up and see what is best in terms of contrast colors to use in that. Luckily, I have a graphic designer who is really great about making sure that none of our publications have those issues. But if you are looking for more information on that, like I said, most of the stuff that I've learned is self-taught just by Googling or YouTube or anything like that. So that is a great point, Rebecca, and I'm glad you brought that up. All right, any other questions?
Looks like there's a question from Jermaine. Thinking about social media marketing, the best route is to make sure the information is typed in words for screen reader accessibility.
So I think this goes back to what I mentioned about hierarchy. And it's something that was one of the first things I learned during my undergrad, because I was a public relations major in undergrad, and they teach you about hierarchy of laying out your information, especially if you're, like, for instance, writing a press release, you want the most information at the top, and you want a subject line or a title that's going to explain exactly what you're going to tell someone. And you want to be as concise as possible about that. So I think a great way to approach it is, I think a key thing about making your communication accessible is being concise and putting the most important information first, so that a screen reader isn't having to dig through and like listen to like tons of information just to get the full concept of what you're trying to tell them. So I would say stick to hierarchy, including, most important information first and moving down that way. But yeah, concise is key. Conciseness is key. I hope that helps, Jermaine. And sometimes I have to look at my content, like I'll look at a caption and be like, that's 3 sentences and that's way too long. And I'll edit it down and then I'll pass it along to maybe my supervisor or one of my student workers and say, hey, can you look at this and edit it again? You really just can't be afraid to ask people to look at your content if you have the resources to do that, if you have the people around you to do that. Never be afraid to pass it along, because someone can always edit it down further and think of a more concise way to convey your information.
Elena, are there any kind of just in general, obviously talking about, accessibility, but just in general rules to kind of follow, or tips and tricks when you're putting together any type of content? So it is more that, I'm from an RP recreation background, so more that universal design.
Well, I think, a few of the things that I talked about today are definitely good rules of thumb to go off of. But I think I can't reiterate enough how simplicity is important. And whether that's with graphics or digital signage, print pieces, anything like that. I think making sure that your information is concise and simple is the best way to approach things and to keep in mind at all times, because more often than not, students get frustrated when they can't access the information they need. They feel like you are talking to everyone but them. And so I think making the conscious effort to not only use these tips and tricks, but also ensure that your information is simple and easy to comprehend. That's just a good rule of thumb across the board, and especially when talking to students. And I would say another thing is, if you have the ability, talk to your students, talk to the people you are working with, to see if there are, suggestions from students. That's been something that has come up with me, is that someone has mentioned something and I've been like, I didn't think about that. that's a really good point. Let's look into that further and see if there's a way that we can resolve that issue. But I think overall, it's just putting in the effort to make sure that your content is simple and easy to understand. And then taking the time to do things like this, or doing your own work, your own research and your own work to figure out the more advanced things that you can be doing. Some of that is for me right now, as I'm learning how to create accessible PDFs through Adobe. And that is not an easy feat. And it's been something I've been working on. But that's like a long-term goal of mine, because if I do need to use that at any point, I have it in my arsenal. So I think taking the time to put the effort in is the most important part, and be willing to learn and continue learning, because accessibility is going to continue to change and it's going to continue to evolve. And at some point, I mean, if you think in legal terms, your institution or your organization could be legally challenged for not being ADA compliant for certain things. So I think it's best to be ahead of the curve in those situations, and put the work in now so that you are already doing what you should be doing by the time that comes. That was a rant. I apologize.
Oh, that's great. It's good information. Are there other questions that anybody out there has that would like to throw that in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question? Is there anything that anybody would like to share in regards to maybe what they're doing at their institution to be kind of follow some of these rules or be accessible?
I would love to hear that if anyone does have anything to share. Like I said, always willing to learn. Or if anyone wants to discuss a struggle that they've had in the past, if you want to brainstorm an idea on how to handle that moving forward, or if you want to troubleshoot.
A little quiet group this morning. Give people maybe a couple minutes if they're maybe typing for that to pop up in the chat.
I can move forward to the next slide too. If you don't feel comfortable speaking out here, you can definitely reach out to me via email. I have my professional Twitter on there, and also my LinkedIn. So if you feel more comfortable emailing me directly, like I said, I'm no expert, but I definitely have a good sense on how to either advise or will be able to answer your question or help you research the question. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you feel more comfortable doing so in that form of communication.
Looks like Ellen shared that she co-teaches something called the Transfer Leadership class in the City Colleges of Chicago. And they have made all the materials for the class accessible. So that's awesome.
That's great, Ellen.
Okay.
Okay, well, I guess everyone
Yeah,
gets
there's
a good chunk of time back on their calendar, which I know no one is probably upset about.
Yes. Well, thank you, Elena, for all of your work on this presentation and sharing with us today. I don't know if there are any of our high school partners here with us today. but I wanted to put the link in the chat to anybody that would like to get continuing education hours if you're on the high school side. So the link to do that is in the chat if you need that. And thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have a great Friday and enjoy the rest of the conference today.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming.
Have a great day.